NASA says that right now is a staggering opportunity to focus on the planet Venus. This follows the recent discoveries of possible life on the planet. If you were to look at NASA's records from the 1960s, you'd see the space agency referring to Venus as a planet of judgment, while Mars became our primary target. Such careful naming of the primary planets wasn't customary during the intense space race period. The Soviet Union was focused on sending missions to Venus, a planet that showed almost no potential for life. Yet, the Soviet space program didn't decommission the Venera program until the fall of the USSR. According to Neil deGrasse Tyson, we now understand why. Join us as we examine the declassified photos from Venus taken by the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union was significant in more ways than one. Not only did it change the course of world history, but it also sealed away many secrets. The Soviets had a strong tendency to keep secrets, from running the most advanced intelligence agencies in the world to being mysterious about their true capabilities. This suggests that extraterrestrial contact might have been one of those well-guarded mysteries. The former superpower holds many untold secrets. Before the U.S. won the race to explore all planetary missions in space, the Soviet Union was leading the way. While the U.S. and the USSR had a history of both successful and failed space missions, the Soviet Union's most prestigious focus was on the controversial planet Venus. In the Russian language, Venus is called Venera, which is also the name of the mission that lasted from 1961 to 1983. During this time, the U.S. was focused on sending its missions to the moon. In a way, the Soviets chose to invest their resources elsewhere. It's not strange to wonder why the Soviets were so fixated on the second planet from the Sun. Did they want to use the planet's surface as a potential power station, or were they possibly looking to colonize it after searching for signs of life beneath the surface? The question remains, why were the Soviets so focused on this harsh planet, especially when they conducted these missions during the Cold War? They weren't entirely open about their objectives. In fact, all we know about the Venus missions comes from declassified and unarchived information. By the way, after so much effort to pinpoint what exactly the Soviets were searching for and whether they ever uncovered the mysteries of Venus, we find that the Soviets didn't land on Venus once or even twice, but often. Yes, that's correct. The Soviets launched 28 costly rockets toward the planet. Moreover, 13 of those entered the Venusian atmosphere, while 8 actually landed. Such complex missions positioned the Soviets in a leading position in space exploration. Sure, the U.S. was a close second, but NASA was more focused on satellites and innovative technology than on searching for life on other planets. Their attention was on Mars, which, in turn, wasn't particularly unusual or especially bad. Your history class might not tell you this, but the Soviet space program was the first to send a probe beyond Earth's atmosphere. It also had another series of firsts to its name. The USSR became the first country to achieve a soft landing on another planet, returning pictures and sounds from the surface of that planet. In fact, the Soviets had their own one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind moment long before the U.S. So, why do we rarely hear about these achievements? Well, remember what we said about the Soviet affinity for keeping secrets. That's just one of many reasons for the oversight of the Soviet space program. In 1992, the famous agency was decommissioned following the collapse of the USSR, and the program had to be revived under a new Russian identity, Roscosmos. Many of its original records were either lost or destroyed. This is precisely why we don't have a clear answer about why the Soviets launched 28 rockets into Venus' atmosphere. Still, we can make a reasonable assumption. Perhaps the Soviet decision to explore Venus was more about cost efficiency than anything else. It's not to say that the space program didn't see the planet's potential. They were looking for water levels, sunlight radiation, and the general qualities of the planet. Without these space missions, it would have been very hard to assess Venus' high temperatures and dense atmosphere. Today, many astronomers don't believe this harsh planet could support life. The temperatures there are high enough to melt lead, and water is scarce. Moreover, Because of its thick atmosphere, the air pressure on Venus is roughly 90 times that of Earth. However, there are still ongoing advancements, and to ignore the USSR's contribution to the exploration of Venus is to revise history. After all, Venus was worth investigating. While it was more expensive to send probes to Venus, it was still far more feasible than sending probes to Mars. This simply boils down to the distance between Earth and another celestial body. On average, the harsh planet is just 40 million kilometers away from Earth, while Mars is on average 250 million kilometers away. Such vast differences in distance lead to significant cost differences. Had the U.S. not been the world's largest economy, it might never have explored Mars with such ease. Various reports suggest that Soviet missions were risky and had significant technical flaws. Of course, the rockets couldn't cover such vast distances, and the USSR had a poor history of losing contact with its rockets. So, it makes sense why the Soviet space program chose a more practical and somewhat closer mission that would yield results. At least, if we don't consider the space race in this context, the story of the Venera missions would be incomplete. The U.S. wasn't even on the space map when the Soviet program launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. This move kicked off the space race and kept the momentum going. What's particularly interesting is why the U.S. focused on the Moon instead of Venus. NASA had a series of failures with its Venus missions during the 1960s. As a result, the U.S. Space Agency encountered a setback known as the Venus Curse. Every time they launched a probe into Venus' atmosphere, it failed. This is when the Soviet Union saw a golden opportunity to capitalize on NASA's failures. Around that time, both the U.S. and the USSR were determined to win the space race. The best strategy was to take advantage of two specific opportunities. It was a quiet, yet decisive, tactic. The Soviet space program sees Earth's sister planet as its first victory in the space race, accomplishing something its main rival had failed to do. Despite the Soviet Union's limited resources and a hesitant government, they repeatedly launched missions to Venus to maintain their lead over the U.S., in contrast to NASA's focus on the Moon. This strategic decision wasn't without malice. Additionally, sharp publicity was used to cloud their major failures with Venus. The American government was prompted to question the USSR's obsession with the planet, with the media dubbing Venus the evil planet, while Mars became humanity's fate. These names didn't matter to the Soviets. Their mission was to prove their superiority over the Americans, and they succeeded. The Venera missions are almost forgotten in modern history, but despite their early struggles, these missions were remarkably advanced, cutting-edge, and aggressive at the dawn of the space age. In the 1950s, the Soviets began testing the designs and technical details of the probes. Over the next 30 years, they continued to build and launch interplanetary spacecraft as part of the Venera program. Since the program ran alongside the intense Cold War, the Soviets focused on improving their resources. Fortunately for them, the early years of the conflict provided them with more resources than the U.S., which turned out to be incredibly important. It allowed them to build larger rockets, capable of reaching great altitudes and covering enormous distances. The Soviets were quick to experiment with both manned and unmanned rockets, while the Soviet scientific community worked on a series of calculations and assessments to chart accurate courses for the Venus missions. Behind the scenes, their Mars programs were also running. Nothing was more important than advancing instrumentation for these missions. This led to significant breakthroughs in the history of space exploration. In 1966, the Soviet Union launched Venera 3, the first artificial probe to enter the atmosphere of Venus and land on its surface. This achievement raised the stakes in the competition between the two superpowers. Unlike American missions, which were plagued by failures and disasters, the Soviet program continued to make progress. Despite their successes, the USSR managed to send successful probes into Venus' atmosphere. The main issue with this approach was the limited design capabilities. The Soviets quickly overcame their design problems and launched some of the most sophisticated probes of the Venera program during the 1970s. Their pioneering efforts allowed them to achieve the first simultaneous launches of Venera 4 and Venera 5. According to most historians, this was the most remarkable decade in the history of space exploration. The U.S. tried to develop similar launch methods. So, why did the Soviet Union choose simultaneous launches to Venus? To understand this, you need to realize that interplanetary travel requires advanced instrumentation to gather the most comprehensive data. The probes were initially launched to study the planet's surface and atmosphere. This required precise instrumentation and detailed planning, which the Soviets had spent years perfecting. The goal was not just to land on Venus, but to collect as much data as possible about its surface, atmosphere, and overall conditions. These efforts were not only groundbreaking, but also helped to shape future space exploration strategies. The success of the Soviet Venera program demonstrated the USSR's technical capabilities in space exploration, particularly in the field of planetary science. While NASA's focus was on the Moon and Mars, the Soviet Union's relentless pursuit of Venus showcased their ability to tackle complex interplanetary missions. Their achievements in sending probes that survived the harsh conditions of Venus' surface were nothing short of remarkable, especially considering the technological limitations of the time. By the 1970s, the Venera program had achieved several significant milestones. The launch of Venera 7 in 1970 marked the first successful transmission of data from the surface of Venus. It provided vital information about the planet's atmosphere and surface temperature. Later missions, such as Venera 9 and Venera 10, sent back the first detailed photographs of Venus' surface, revealing a barren and rocky landscape, confirming the planet's inhospitable nature. Despite the setbacks and challenges faced by the Soviet space program, their accomplishments in Venus exploration were undeniable. These missions contributed greatly to our understanding of the planet, and their findings continue to influence modern research and exploration. The data collected by the Venera probes laid the groundwork for subsequent missions, including those by NASA and other space agencies. As the Cold War came to an end and the Soviet Union collapsed, much of the history surrounding these missions was obscured or forgotten. The fall of the USSR led to a shift in priorities, with the Russian space program focusing more on international cooperation and new projects. However, the legacy of the Soviet Venus missions lives on. They stand as a testament to the ingenuity and determination of the Soviet space program, which, despite being overshadowed by NASA's achievements, made significant contributions to the exploration of our solar system. In retrospect, the Venera missions were not just about exploring Venus. They were about proving the Soviet Union's technological prowess during a time of intense rivalry with the United States. The missions to Venus demonstrated the USSR's ability to undertake complex and ambitious space endeavors, and they serve as a key part of the broader space race. Today, as we look back on the history of space exploration, we must remember the crucial role that the Soviet Union played in advancing our knowledge of Venus and the solar system. As a whole, the Venera missions also had significant scientific implications beyond their immediate goals. By studying Venus, the Soviets helped expand our understanding of planetary atmospheres and the conditions that make a planet habitable or not. Venus' extreme surface conditions, including temperatures hot enough to melt lead and an atmosphere thick with carbon dioxide, offered a contrast to Earth that revealed the consequences of a runaway greenhouse effect. This research has since been invaluable in the study of climate change, as it provided a real-world example of how atmospheric conditions can spiral out of control, making a planet uninhabitable. In addition to the scientific data collected, the technological advancements made by the Soviet Union during the Venera missions were also groundbreaking. The development of probes that could survive the intense heat and pressure on Venus' surface was a remarkable achievement. These probes were equipped with highly sophisticated instruments designed to measure temperature, atmospheric pressure, and composition, as well as capture images of the planet's surface. The Soviets also designed their spacecraft to withstand the hostile environment, with heat shields and specialized electronics that allowed the probes to function for a limited time on Venus' surface before succumbing to the extreme conditions. The legacy of the Venera program also extended to future interplanetary missions. The success of these missions showed that it was possible to explore planets with harsh environments and pave the way for later missions to planets like Mars, Jupiter, and beyond. Even today, space agencies continue to build on the lessons learned from the Venera probes in their quest to explore the farthest reaches of our solar system and beyond. Despite the critical role the Soviet Union played in the exploration of Venus, the history of the Venera missions remains largely overshadowed by the moon landing and Mars exploration, particularly in Western narratives. The secrecy surrounding the Soviet space program and the Cold War rivalry led to the underappreciation of their achievements in the public eye. The U.S. space program, with its high-profile moon landings and successful Mars missions, captured much of the global attention, while the Soviet Union's successes often went unnoticed outside of specialized scientific circles. However, as we continue to explore Venus and other planets in our solar system, the Soviet contributions are becoming more recognized and appreciated. Modern space exploration initiatives, including NASA's own missions to Venus, like the upcoming Veritas mission, are building upon the pioneering work of the Venera program. These new missions aim to study Venus in greater detail, seeking to understand its past, its climate, and whether it may have once had conditions conducive to life. In many ways, the Venera missions were ahead of their time. While other space agencies were focused on more accessible targets like the Moon and Mars, the Soviet Union's determination to explore Venus with cutting-edge technology proved to be a significant achievement in the history of space exploration. Their relentless pursuit of knowledge about Venus, despite the many challenges they faced, serves as a reminder of the ambitious spirit that drove the space race and the desire to push the boundaries of human exploration. Today, as we look to the future of space exploration, we continue to ask the same fundamental questions that motivated the Soviet Venera missions. What can we learn from other planets? How do extreme environments shape the potential for life? And how far can our technology take us in our quest to understand the cosmos? The answers to these questions will likely shape the next chapter in the story of space exploration, continuing the legacy of those who first dared to explore the unknown. The Venera missions, though nearly forgotten in modern history, played a crucial role in answering these questions and remain an integral part of our shared journey into space.